Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us. I'm Danielle Gauthier, Senior Product Marketing Manager for Threat Intelligence at Dragos. Welcome to our webinar on moving from reactive to proactive, elevating OT cybersecurity with threat intelligence. Today, Josh Hanrahan, one of my favorite adversary hunters, is going to help us understand the critical role OT threat intelligence plays as part of your overall cybersecurity journey. And he'll talk about some of the ways that your teams can use it most effectively. Josh will also share some real-world scenarios on using OT threat groups that are currently active. This webinar is a great introduction to some of the excellent threat intelligence reporting and worldview, and that we bake into the Dragos platform to monitor for adversary activity in your ICS environment. Now, I'd like to introduce the expert leading today's session, Josh Hanrahan, Principal Adversary Hunter. Over to you, Josh.
Thanks, Danielle. So my name is Josh Hanrahan. I'm a Principal Adversary Hunter at Dragos. Today, we're going to be talking about an intelligence-first approach to OT cybersecurity. Just a quick background on myself. So as I said, I'm a Principal Adversary Hunter at Dragos. My focus is mainly electric focused threat groups and the Asia Pacific region. Previously, before I was at Dragos, I was the lead threat hunter at Australia's biggest bank, where I was a senior manager of a threat hunting team for hunting against internal telemetry on banking services. Before that, I was at the Australian energy market operator for 6 years as a threat intelligence analyst and a threat hunter. If you have any questions or want to contact me after this, there's some contact information down the bottom. Always happy to talk CTI stuff any day. So a quick agenda of what we're going to go through today. Firstly, we'll be talking about the Dragos threat discovery team, how we kind of fit into our worldview intelligence products and how we're tracking adversary groups. Secondly, we'll define cyber threat intelligence, then take a look at the industrial threat landscape. We'll pivot across to a quick case study on Cite and Electrum. They're both ICS-focused threat groups. And lastly, we'll talk about how to operationalize OT threat intel. So Dragos effectively does cyber threat intelligence for OT systems or ICS entities, and we're only focused on ICS. We're not focused on any other sectors, essentially. We are the largest private cyber threat intelligence team that is focused purely on ICS. And we have kind of 4 main responsibility areas. The first being threat discovery, which is the team I sit in. So we're responsible for tracking and uncovering emerging threat groups or temporary activity clusters, and then following them as they progress into ICS-focused threat groups. We're also responsible for maintaining and tracking and updating existing threat groups that have shown disruption capability to ICS. Our second function is performing vulnerability analysis. So the team that handles this is responsible for triaging vulnerabilities for ICS equipment that are published on whatever cadence it is, and coming up with a framework to assess which ones should have the most criticality for asset owners and operators, like which ones should be actioned first, because patching everything within an OT environment just isn't a feasible approach as it is in IT. Our third focus area is malware analysis. So these are the people that are reverse engineering ICS capable malware and creating signatures and feeding that information back into one big intelligence loop where my team can analyze and make assessments on the findings and link them back to threat groups and then disseminate that intelligence out. And the last part of our capabilities is putting all of that information, the TTPs of threat groups and indicators of compromise, etc., through to our detection engineering team, which then feeds the detections into our Dragos platform. So some of the outputs of what our team does is the Dragos Worldview platform, which is curated, focused, timely, and actionable threat intelligence reports. We also have a concierge analyst service where it is a dedicated CTI analyst working on intelligence needs related to your geography and industrial subsector. And then also our last output is threat detections, vulnerability data, and indicators are all codified in a structured way within the Dragos platform. So the threat discovery team, which I sit in, is comprised of adversary hunters who, as I said, are responsible for tracking ICS-focused threat groups. And that's globally, like not just in the areas that we have presence. We are concerned in safeguarding civilization and looking out for those threats that affect any jurisdiction, really. We use a combination of open source and proprietary data sources to inform our collection and to perform analysis. And the outputs of that is production of relevant, timely, and actionable threat intelligence. So as I said, global coverage, but we do have regional focus within sub-geographies. So we have a US presence, an Australian presence, a European presence, and a GCC presence. And we do have tailored reporting for customers in those areas and subsectors within the geographic regions in forms of threat perspectives or more kind of boots on the ground in those areas to hopefully drive out more products. But we are still focused globally. So the primary purpose of the threat discovery group is to really uncover threat groups with the intent to target ICS. We track over 20 threat groups that have displayed intent or have impacted ICS in the past. And we detail all our new threat groups for the public in the year in review report. So we've tracked groups from 2017 with one of the big ones that has a stage 2, according to the ICS cyber kill chain capability. So as in they do have capability to disrupt ICS processes. That's Electrum, all the way through up until last year when we detailed the Chernobyl threat group and the pipe dream framework. So the threat discovery team has 3 main methods that we use for our threat hunts to discover threat groups. So the first one is focused on industry and region. So it's hypothesis-led focused hunts. And we have an hypothesis formulated on some type of strategic level or some type of operational or tactical level that we want to test. So this could be that we assess that a certain threat group may be moving into a certain geography to aid, disruption or political gain or whatever it may be, where there may be an impact to ICS. It could be an industrial subsector as well. We could be, concerned about the electric sector within a certain geography. And we've seen some threat groups doing initial reconnaissance and kind of poking around. So we would take those threat groups, TTVs, and try and figure out what their likely next step could be. And then we would start using things from our collection, like global net flow and other tools to try and see what's being talked to, how it's interacting with outside communications, and things like that. Our second approach is more of a victim-centric approach, where we really go that one layer deeper. So where the industry and region focus is more based on strategic intelligence and looking at a bird's eye view of a sector or geography, victim-centric may be from an IR engagement or some other unique identification of a victim, but it also could be an hypothesis led on certain threat groups moving into certain victim categories. So say an electric grid operator within a certain area that we've seen other electric grid operators in surrounding countries being popped by a certain threat group. And then we pivot to then expand our hypothesis to include neighboring countries. But instead of looking at, say, the electric grid and everything that communicates in terms of different entities, we would be looking at external footprints of one particular entity. Our third method relates to threat groups specifically. So we're tracking tactics, techniques, and procedures of threat groups. We are looking at commonalities in their provisioning methods. A lot of threat intelligence glorifies threat groups and adversaries, threat actors to a certain extent by giving them caricatures and giving them fancy names. We name our groups after rare alloys or minerals. because they are a disposable thing. Like we don't really want to give them an identity as such. At the end of the day, threat groups morph, they mutate, they are people behind keyboards. And just as defenders are people behind keyboards, so are adversaries. They are, most of the time when they are the groups that are targeting ICS, state intelligence agencies, equipped with tooling to go after ICS organizations. And they do have, fairly regimented working hours and standard operating procedures, etc. So as much as some adversaries do like to live off the land and evade detection, etc., they still prescribe to the same standard operating procedures. And that could translate into certain artifacts getting left behind. So they may favor certain ASNs or, IP providers that we know that they always like to use, or they may always provision a certain version of a web hosting software. We track a lot of these different minute details that aren't specifically atomic indicators of compromise. They're more techniques on the adversary tradecraft. And once you kind of do big data analysis, pulling in different net flow and different information from IP whois records, etc., you can start to paint a picture and start to follow leads on what these threat groups may be provisioning. So now we're going to talk a little bit about defining CTI. So good threat intelligence is always focused on quality and not quantity. Intelligence without context is just data. It's not useful. The key core thing about intelligence is it should have context, it should be relevant, and it should be timely. It doesn't necessarily have to be completely finished, but it has to be finished to a level where assessments can be made with a certain confidence level that defenders can take action on. It always should be evidence-based and use multiple sources if possible. And when I'm talking about confidence assessment language, at Dragos, we use low, moderate, and high for our assessments. Now, when we use low, doesn't necessarily mean something is almost not true. It means that we believe it is true with a certain percentage of certainty. And that low kind of metric is more like a 30 to 40% type confidence, right? So we're not saying it's not a sliding scale of not true to true. It's a scale of confidence of true and how confident we are that it is true. And generally, when we give a low confidence assessment, we normally tie it back to our sources. So other places and other teams can do it different ways. I've seen this carved up different ways, but data sources seems to be a good underpinning framework behind that confidence assessment language. So saying something is low confidence is normally one source. Moderate confidence would normally be two strong sources. If we're giving a high confidence assessment, it means it's almost certainly likely, and we would always have multiple sources underpinning that assessment. And so when I'm talking about sources here, I'm talking about information or evidence that would allow us to analyze it and then make an assessment on something. So if I was saying this piece of infrastructure has been provisioned by a particular threat group, then one of my sources of confidence may be IP whois records, and they're using a registrar identity that we have seen tracked on infrastructure used by that threat group in the past. My second source could be it could be like a customer IR engagement where certain types of information has been exfilled in the same way. So like, the same techniques used, same lateral movement techniques, zipped up with a similar file name to other incidents by that threat group. So those type of things are data sources that will make us make an assessment to say, this belongs to this threat group. So we should also always follow a structured intelligence lifecycle and process. So we're talking about, collection of data. We're talking about exploiting that data or structuring in a way that we can, look for patterns and pick out needle in a haystack type stuff. Then we're analyzing it. we're reporting on it, and then we are disseminating those reports. It should always be a loop. It should always have actionable guidance to mitigate and preempt threats. So intelligence main purpose is for defenders to provide guidance to help preempt and mitigate any threats, right? If we're just writing intelligence reports about a cool new attack vector, but it hasn't been cited anywhere, it's just a theoretical thing, then it's not really helping anyone. That's more of a research paper, that's not threat intelligence. It should always have a relevant audience, whether that's specific industry or a specific business. And if it is a specific industry or business or geography, whatever it is, the language should be tailored to that region. So it'd be very different writing a report for, say, a strategic report, which is more aimed at decision makers in the US in a general concept, as to, say, Australian energy generators. There should be certain language caveats that goes with some of these, not just from like a grammatical aspect in terms of being various differences in the language from English US and English Australian, but in terms of the audience that will receive that report. It has to be able to communicate to the intended recipients in a manner that they could read it and go, okay, this is the action I need to take. They should also incorporate, any good intelligence should also incorporate timely updates and changes to the threat landscape. So, from the past 10, 15 years, the threat landscape has pivoted multiple times. If we're talking about the last few years with the Ukraine and Russian war and the deployment of wipers and that type of stuff, and then going further back from the rise of ransomware, and then, going back even further to like 15 years ago, where the landscape was very different and it was only a tit for tat type back and forth between state intelligence agencies, and never really did the public kind of get too involved to the extent that it is now. And we didn't have these capabilities falling into organized crime's hands and the rise of ransomware and hacktivism, etc. Like it still existed, but it hasn't it wasn't scaled out to the point it is today. So any reporting should be able to show from a strategic level any timely updates to that shift in threat landscape. And threat intelligence should really be used as part of an overall OT cybersecurity strategy. So ICS IT and OT are very different in the needs from a cybersecurity strategy. ICS threat intelligence should really be employed within kind of your OT cybersecurity strategy. Really, as I'm talking about like a loop, when we're talking about, Intel products informing detections, mitigations, any incident response or any type of contingency events that occur, that information is getting fed back up into intelligence to be analyzed again to then go back out. All defense efforts should really kind of flow back into intelligence for analysis and then move back out to dissemination. So this is kind of like a bit of a framework that's used pretty heavily within the CTI industry. And this is the diamond model of intrusion analysis. So effectively, there's 4 vertices: adversary, capabilities, victim, and infrastructure. Most CTI shops will use this to communicate different things. We use it for our threat groups to have a visual. Some people communicate and understand concepts better in a visual capability if they just want a high level kind of overview. And reading a 20-page document of very specific adversary tradecraft isn't the best way to communicate that. So I find it as a very good communication medium. So just a quick overview: adversary, what we would have for this activity group in the middle, we would have, this is the group we are detailing. At the top vertex, we would have adversary, which is really, just bullet points about, their online presence, their accounts, their intent, any human fingerprints. So, like aliases they are using, if they've been attributed to any particular physical entity, any online presence at all, any assessed motivation or intent. So, from their actions, what is the intent, the assessed intent of what they're trying to do, what are their likely motivations. Moving across the capabilities, this is really the tools and techniques, where their expertise is, what malware they're using, what exploits, any methods they're using to stage data, and their OPSEC considerations. Victim really shows the victim of receiving the attack, I guess. So the recipient of the capabilities. So, organizations, people, etc. So we may detail here, like, North American ONG or, New Zealand Electric, etc. At Dragos, we only name a threat group if they purposely show intent to affect ICS or OT systems. So, and I'll get into it later on how we kind of break out those kind of threat groups and how we categorize them. But if they're only kind of showing a opportunistic look into ICS systems, say ransomware, then we would never assess them as a threat group because that is not their primary objective. And moving across to the last one, which is infrastructure. So this is more hard evidence. So, details of C2 nodes, domains, hosting IP addresses, service accounts. Now, we wouldn't list like all indicators of compromise in here. We would just be like, the adversary prefers to use this ASN. The adversary names their masqueraded domains after, potential victims, etc. It's just kind of like a high level notes of adversary tradecraft. So where to find threat intel? So effectively, intelligence is kind of broken out into, when we're doing collection from different data sources, 3 different categories. So you got first party data, second party data, and third and fourth party data is kind of grouped together. And this is like relevant for consumers as well as CTI teams as well. Like I have my first party data, I have my second party data, and I have my third party data that I draw in to do analysis on and to create assessments. But when we're talking about consumers, so if you're a platform customer, first party data would be stuff that would be occurring within your network. So you could generate intelligence from that. It's stuff that you have collected yourself. No one else has collected it for you. Second party data is involved with collaboration with partners and sharing information. So peer-to-peer sharing, joint cybersecurity operations, partner agreements. From a Dragos customer's perspective, this would be services such as Neighborhood Keeper, which is a anonymous opt-in service, essentially, where your data is anonymized, but you can see trends between different different participants that also subscribe to Keeper, that you may be able to see, hey, these participants in this general industrial vertical are seeing this type of activity, and so are we. Well, that's an interesting trend to correlate. Generally, other sources for second party data would be stuff like any information sharing groups, ISACs, etc. And they may come with like information handling caveats, so like TLP Amber, Amber Strict, and Red. So what you kind of analyze and disseminate out to your consumers as a CTI team, if you are a CTI team, then would have different restrictions on it. Third and fourth party data. So that's from purely external sources. And I apologize, I put ISACs in the wrong category. It should have been third party data. So any threat intel providers, ISACs, government advisories, or OSINT, that is all third party data. So why is ICS or OT CTI different? So when we're talking about ICS cyber threat intelligence being different, fundamentally it is because IT and OT systems are different. There's different systems, different networks, traffic, different adversaries, and different need to manage vulnerabilities in a completely different manner. The threat landscape overall is different. OT and whether it's from a malicious, non-malicious point of view, requires specialized knowledge and understanding of how those systems link together. Where the impact within IT networks, for example, may be loss of data, IP or network services, revenue generation, financial impact. Conversely, on the flip side, large impacts within OT could be, loss of electricity, which has flow-on cascading effects to other industries and humanity as a whole. Could be disruption of water systems, gas and plant operations and manufacturing. So the impact of those are very different from a bank losing money, for example. And when adversaries are kind of looking at IT or OT, the technical intelligence may be similar in terms of TTPs or IOCs, so how they kind of pivot through the networks, and at a theory level, lateral movement, persistence, credential reuse, etc., may be similar in terms of tactics, but the procedures and how that's done kind of differs between IT and OT. And within the OT, you kind of really need that really specialized knowledge to understand that. And then additionally, the decision-making calculus is quite different from both the victim side and the adversary side. So when we're talking about the victim side, you're talking about things like ransomware, where it may be easier for an operator to pay $2 million in ransom than to have their complete grid blacked out for a week. That has cascading consequences onto humanity as a whole and just other sectors the same way. And then from the adversary side, the decision-making calculus is different as well. So it really depends on the intent and motivation of the adversary on what they're trying to do. And we've seen in the past where some events, the adversary has caused unintended disruption and really kind of brought down OT networks when it kind of wasn't their intent. They were just doing reconnaissance. So that's why it requires that specialized knowledge of these systems to be able to understand how they can achieve their objectives. So when we're talking about classes of ICS threats, and I mentioned this earlier on how we classify threat groups. So we have kind of three categories we put them into: ICS curious, ICS capable, and ICS adjacent. ICS curious are adversaries that are known to have an interest in industrial organizations, ICS or OT networks. So for example, Camicide, which is the initial access group that provides those initial footholds to the Electrum threat group. So their objectives is to have an interest in ICS entities, but they don't necessarily have a capability to disrupt ICS critical operations. Then we move on to ICS capable, which is threats directly impacting the operation of ICS. So we're talking about groups that have reached stage 2 of the ICS cyber kill chain. So Electrum, Xenotime, Chinovite. And the third category are ICS adjacent. So this is really not threats associated with ICS, but have a high likelihood of disrupting operations. And for example, ransomware. Hacktivism would always also fit into that category, where there may be a opportunity that's seen and they'll amplify doing something not that impactful. But really, ICS adjacent is mainly focused on ransomware, where they know ICS organizations will pay if the impact is greater than pain, but they are not solely focused on disrupting ICS. And if they were inside an OT network, they wouldn't know the first thing what to do. So we're going to have a quick look at the current threat landscape. As I mentioned earlier, we have 20 public threat groups targeting ICS and OT. Some of them, especially the ones that have reached stage 2 of the ICS cyber kill chain, have ICS-specific tailored malware. So that is malware that was created with the intent of doing something specific within an OT network to disrupt or destroy processes. Some of them target supply chain, which is another attack vector to move closer to the intended recipient of the capability. So OEMs, telecoms, data centers. Another thing to look at that groups are going after is remote access or vendor access. Remote access, unsecured endpoints sitting out on the net. I've done some research in the past about ICS edge routers, where effectively you have a 4G router at a remote site, whether it's a mining site or an electrical substation, etc. So there is mobile routers with 4G SIM cards put in, and they are effectively talking out to the internet to give an OT network underneath internet access in a remote location. The problem is a lot of these do have vulnerabilities that are unpatched, but they sit out on the internet, which causes the likelihood of risk to the overall hygiene of that underlying network. It's quite high up. By default, with default settings, some of them may have default passwords in there that if an adversary figures that out or a ransomware group figures that out, they will start using wide exploitative scanning to try and log into these devices, and then they have control. Not only that, I've seen some of them leaking geolocation device out of the box with the default configuration that can be quite hard to turn off. I've tracked entire electric networks purely off a use of a particular vendor's ICS capable router, where I can map out every substation they had within a certain area, just because they are broadcasting their exact GPS locations on the login page for that router that is posted out to the net. Depending on the technology and depending on the vendor of the router, taking control of that could then allow you to pivot further into the OT network behind that. That's controlling that substation. And it really gets into the weeds of how the network's configured. But it is a valid entry point. And then vulnerability exploitation to enable process disruption. Again, similar method, coming from the outside, exploiting a vulnerability, laterally moving in, likely sitting within the OT network, looking for credential reuse or that I could replay to move into the OT network, looking for data historians and trying to exfil that data out to have an overview of what's going on within the OT network is something we've seen as well. So along with the diamond model of intrusion analysis, another good communication method for framing up intelligence is the MITRE attack for industrial control systems. So each column relates to a tactic, and then each kind of black cell or each cell is a technique. So this is similar to attack for enterprise, but this is purely focused on ICS. So some will overlap in some of the techniques will overlap. They're not exactly the same, but when we're looking at initial access right at the start of an attack path, spear phishing attachment, etc. Some of those will overlap with attack for enterprise, but as we move along the attack and once we get up to about lateral movement / collection, that's when the techniques really start to change. And then you'll see, impair process control, inhibit response function are purely related to OT networks. And it really kind of shows the motivation of an adversary and what they might be aiming for. And it's a good medium to overlap different threat groups or illustrate the coverage of detections or data underlying your ability to detect or threat hunt in those areas as a visual standpoint. So as we kind of touched on earlier, new threat group research is delivered in Worldview as we become aware of new activity. And then we detail new threat groups for the public in the year-end review report. That is normally at the start of the year, so we're a little ways off, but it is coming up pretty close. I'm going to jump into a quick case study on Cite and Electrum. So Cite and Electrum are both threat groups that we track. They're both ICS capable. Cite is the initial access group that hands over, from what we can tell, exclusively to Electrum. So they are looking after essentially stage 1 of the ICS cyber kill chain, and Electrum handles the majority of stage 2. So they are likely employed by the same operating structure. One group has a certain focus, which is here is a list of targets. Go and find any holes you can get into here. Once you have persistence and initial access, and they move that over to Electrum. And then if Electrum have their targeting list that says, yep, we want to go after this organization or this entity, whatever, then that's when they take over, take up those initial footholds that have already been gathered, and then start to work their, I was going to call it magic, but that probably isn't the best word. work their nefarious methods. So a background on them. They're most responsible for the 2016 crash override event, which affected about 250,000 homes in Ukraine. That has now progressed in Cite being used as an initial access crew for the Russian-Ukrainian war in the last kind of 2 years. We've seen stuff from Electrum as well, but definitely in the public view or from third-party sources, the operations that have been most detailed, especially from Ukrainian CERT, has been activity that we attribute back to the Cite threat group. So back in February 2022, they were responsible for the Cyclops Blink malware, which was targeting vulnerabilities in Soho devices. In March, they moved on to WatchGuard firewall and router devices and ASUS firewall and router devices. In April, the malware from Cyclops Blink on vulnerable firewall devices was removed, as in a cleaning up method. In May of 22, they then moved on to large sets of routers and IP cameras outside of Cyclops Blink operations. And then in June, they started poking around the same Oblenigo, which is kind of like a transmission operator that was targeted in a 2015 Ukraine cyber attack. They kind of went back and started poking around and tried to get an initial access foothold back there. Then in 2023, they've been observed utilizing the Dark Crystal malware. So the way that we assess Cite is that they overlap with sandworm activity tracked by others. We don't say that threat groups have one-to-one mapping with other assessed threat groups from other vendors or other assessment organizations, I guess. Because ultimately, at the core of the problem is we could, say that this group equals this group, but the data underlying the assessments, because intelligence is just assessments based on facts collected from data sources, the data underlying those could be vastly different. So if we're saying, this group equals this group, then anything that we're like, say, for example, if we say Cite equals sandworm, then anything anyone else ever says about sandworm, we're taking as fact that it also, by extension, means Cite. However, that could be wildly untrue. And we've seen attribution issues in the past from CTI, in the CTI sector in general, really. And it's kind of like an ongoing issue, I guess, because it makes it difficult for defenders to have to track all these different groups and different assessments. And it makes it different from the other side as a CTI vendor to figure out, what's what and how does this group kind of overlap with this group. So the best way that we try to kind of cut through the noise is that we'll say that this group's operations from, this threat cluster overlaps with what others track as this. We may have slight differences on our assessments, and we might have slight differences on our data collection, which will change the assessment. But ultimately, we like to demonstrate an overlap and not a one-for-one mapping. The capabilities of Cite, pivoting away from the kind of attribution stuff, they like phishing and credential replay for initial access, custom malware development and deployment, like Dark Crystal and Cyclops Blink. Victims has always been, Europe and Ukraine, a little bit of the US in the past, but their primary focus the last 2 years has been Ukraine. So I mentioned Ukrainian CERT before. So they've detailed over the past 2 years, at least 7 wipers deployed in Ukraine since the beginning of the Russian invasion. So Whisperkill, Desert Blade, Matic Wiper, Isaac Wiper, Caddy Wiper, etc. We're not saying all of them are attributed to Cite. However, we have noted overlap some of these with Cite operations and with Petrobite operations, which is another group that fits in with that same organizational construct. And this has really been used as a fast and dirty disruption approach against Ukrainian targets. So wiping data, moving on. It's an approach that doesn't mean that Electrum has to deploy whatever new ICS disruptive capability they have and burn that tool so defenders would be able to detect for it. Because ICS disruptive capabilities, where they are like custom ICS malware frameworks like Pipedream, take years of project management and planning to make from different sources that may be outsourced, maybe in-house, to all come together. And burning that is a massive commitment of money. So when they have an initial access group, they can go and achieve similar effects with open source tools or malware with a low sophistication. They're going to use it. The interesting thing is that some of those have kind of evolved a little bit into just being straight up annoying. So Microsoft reported on a new wiper used by Cadet Blizzard, which effectively the wiper targets the master boot record, which is what Windows uses to know what to boot from when it starts up. But it also includes a fake ransomware note with no mechanism for data recovery. So the victims may think that they've been targeted by a ransomware attack and start going on to backups and everything, but really it was just a wiper. The concerning thing about all this wiper malware being used in a wartime scenario with both kinetic attacks as well is that wiper malware used within that Eastern European region has a demonstrated history of spreading into neighboring EU countries, for example, NotPetya or Shamoon, which both had some pretty bad effects. So Electrum, so in April 2022, ESET reported malware was uncovered at a Ukrainian utility provider. They're also responsible for InDestroyer, which overlaps with what we class as crash override. Recently in 2022, InDestroyer 2 is what it was dubbed, was seen, and that was used in attacks. It was less of a 2.0 and more of a slight revision to the first version. They were structurally quite similar. And then also, the coordinating of the wiper malware being deployed of InDestroyer 2 was Caddy Wiper, Orc Shred, Solo Shred, and Awful Shred, which again links into those camera side operations. And just recently, there was details on a Ukrainian energy company that had Electrum activity affecting their micro SCADA systems. So this is on the right here, this graphic is just showing we're looking at the Purdue model here. This was InDestroyer 2, which was a variant of crash override. Looking at level 2 in the supervisory control layer. So executing level 2, moving down into level 1, then hides in IEC 104 traffic to a substation, and then pivots down into level 0 to physically turn breakers on and off. So operationalizing OT threat intel. So really we're talking about 3 concepts here: internal and external visibility, OT intel for IT, and operational factors, maturity and capabilities. So when we're talking about internal and external visibility, we're talking about acquiring those enough data resources and visibility into your OT network and understanding those outside factors. So collecting data where you can within your OT network by whatever means, and being able to organize that in a way to aid detection or aid response or threat hunting, whichever you need to do. When we're looking at OT intel for IT, we're talking about getting that communication up and flowing with the IT side of the house to understand what paths adversaries may take through the IT network to reach an OT network, and what the motivation intent may be for an adversary targeting an ICS organization to likely get at an end goal within the OT network. And when we're talking about operational factors or maturity and capabilities, really understanding that impediment to response, for example, not having endpoint detection, or not having telemetry available, or whatever it is, not having processes in place, playbooks for response, etc. So it's really kind of understanding how you can use this intel and kind of being prepared. So the last thing we'll kind of talk about is having 3 essential layers of a maturity framework. So we're talking about a baseline, operationalize, and optimize. So when we're talking about a baseline maturity capability, we're talking about having only a few processes in place to action CTI, and you would likely have low visibility into your company's network and assets. So some things that may be outcomes from this would be, integrating IOCs with your RT SOC, at least in a monitor mode, not in like a hard block. Depending on the intelligence and the context related to it is up to you on kind of how you deploy it. But at least understanding your top threats and critical points of weaknesses, doing things like crown jewel analysis, doing threat models to understand what adversaries may be trying to get to within your network, and then knowing the groups that are likely to target your geography or industry subsector. And then really identifying your OT cybersecurity requirements. So what is it that you need out of an OT cybersecurity program? What part do you need OT CTI to fit into? Then moving on to the operationalized maturity level. So this is where you may have a dedicated CTI analyst responding to trends and informing security posture decisions. You may start to be getting increased visibility of networks and assets. You may start reporting on industry-specific threat landscape for developments. You may start looking at managing your OT vulnerabilities and how they can be remediated or mitigated, or putting defensive controls in place. And you may be looking at validating your defensive controls. So this, from a CTI perspective as well, this could be more strategic reports or CTI reports on IR engagements where OT is impacted, etc. The last maturity level is really kind of optimized. So taking that foundation from the last two levels and really kind of refining it and improving it. So it's coming up with priority intelligence requirements and defining new capabilities to stay ahead of security trends. So intelligence requirements are effectively questions that you want answered about the data sets you have. So intelligence requirement may be, are we vulnerable for this exploit? And do we have telemetry for this system over here? All these little intelligence requirements, and they could also be external ones like, is threat group X targeting electric within my geography? They're all tasks and assigned to analysts or intelligence analysts, but the things that kind of overlap them to kind of give them some structure is that they should all report up to 4 or 5 key priority intelligence requirements, which really drives the direction of your CTI team. So this could be more generalized questions that would have a lot of those kind of mini sub questions or intelligence requirements linked to them that really kind of inform your strategy. You could also be looking at leveraging metrics and playbooks, red teaming exercise, and really trying to drive out as much visibility of network and assets as possible. Some of the outcomes of this could be planning and test responses to active threats, hunting for malicious activity inside your OT network, and developing custom detections. So that's it for me. I hope you found some of this useful. Again, any questions, my contact information was up the front, or reach out to anyone at Dragos. I'm sure anyone will be available to help. Thank you.
Thanks for your time today, and a big thank you to Josh for sharing his expertise with us. So to learn more about how Dragos OT threat intelligence can help you move from reactive to proactive when it comes to cyber threats targeting industrial infrastructure, and if you like what you heard today, you can sign up for a demo on our website. So thank you again for your time today, and have a great day.